Thank you very much, everyone. What we're going to do within this portion of the day's events is we're going to move our lens slightly away from the realm of the retailer and the producer to center attention on both the microsocial level of lived consumer experience with plastic. So kind of the nitty-gritty day-to-day events and habits around plastic that people are involved in, but also the wider macro structures to shape, molds, and ultimately encapsulate consumer behavior. So with that kind of focus on the user or the consumer, the subject, the discarder of plastic, whatever we want to call it, we're going to kind of focus in on that level of consumption experience. So that falls under the remit of the consumption work package of the plastic packaging in people's lives overall project. And our intention is really to understand and appreciate plastic by getting close to consumers' lives, by looking through a microscope at how consumers include, use, and think about plastic in the home, at work, during their commutes, and in their leisure time. So we can better understand and effectively appreciate the furtive omnipresence of plastic within our consumer culture. So first up within the session, we're going to hear from Dr. Caroline Moraes, a reader in marketing and consumer research, and I believe currently the head of Department of Marketing at the University of Birmingham Business School. So Caroline's work takes a focus on consumer ethics, consumer activism, power issues in consumer culture, and sustainability from a broad range of angles. As you will see today from Caroline's presentation, Caroline is committed to theoretically informed consumer research that seeks to benefit consumers and society sustainably, and she has contributed extensively to the field. So it's great to have you here today, Caroline. After that, we're going to hand you over to our own Dr. Charlotte Hadley, who is the active postdoctoral researcher and lead fieldwork agent on the consumer research side front of the Plastic Packaging in People's Lives project. Charlotte will talk you through some of the key issues and contextualize our plans to move forward with undertaking what effectively will be ethnographic research.
I'd like to start by thanking you all for inviting me to deliver this talk. I feel very honored to be here because I think it's such an important topic, such an important project, and I look forward to seeing how it progresses. So, okay, so I'd like to start by putting consumer responsibility into context, and I believe that most of us are on the same page on this. So we know that social, economic, and environmental issues of local and global magnitude are sparking grand challenges that cannot be solved by single stakeholder groups, and certainly not by people in their roles as consumers. Sustainability demands that governments, non-governmental organizations, community groups, businesses, and consumers work together to achieve carbon neutrality and develop more sustainable and resilient societies and markets. It is in this context that I address the role of the consumer in enabling a more sustainable future, the challenges of consuming sustainably, and relevant implications for plastic packaging debates. And I hope that some of the points I'm making today, I know that many of them do already resonate with many of the conversations that we've been having this morning. And I hope also to offer some potentially provocative areas that we might want to discuss further as well. So, as we move towards tackling sustainability, we need to consider what these environmental goals might mean for people and their practices, and how we can implement sustainability goals in ways that work. So in this new book, for example, by Jennifer Tyree Hageman and I, we use the definition of sustainable consumption as consumption that has as its main goal the reduction of the resource intensity in our production consumption systems, and therefore it entails consuming less. It is seen as part of a circular production, consumption, disposable loop, rather than something that is a standalone, disconnected set of social practices. So in the context of plastics, we could argue that these behaviors would include choosing products with very little or preferably no packaging, extending the life of unavoidable plastics where possible by reusing and/or repurposing longer lasting packaging, and potentially changing attitudes around some plastics, perhaps by repositioning them as valuable rather than disposable materials, with the use of recycling and landfill as the last possible options. Of course, as we have discussed this morning, this is not always possible. And while consumer research might inform, for example, packaging design and perhaps some of the materials used in such packaging, consumers are not the decision makers who determine how their food products are packaged, for example. So in this particular paper that you see on the screen, we looked at these groups of very committed consumers, and they've gone as far as forming what we have termed new consumption communities. So new consumption communities are groups of production engaged consumers who change their lifestyles to reduce their environmental footprints. Garden to plate practices in these communities mean little or no packaging, and increasingly we see initiatives such as grassroots community gardening projects, community supported agriculture, and alimenteering emerge. Some with the added benefit of addressing food insecurity, community cohesion, and well-being simultaneously. Now, one could argue that these are very extreme examples and that most consumers are not or will not be willing to reconfigure their practices in such radical ways. That attempts to consume less are somewhat antithetical to the logics of consumer societies and indeed our capitalist systems, which measure the degree of success by indices of growth. Indeed, this is the biggest challenge we face in moving towards sustainable modes of consumption, as we're still relying on the idea that consuming green rather than consuming less can make a difference. In other words, we're still using the same neoliberal capitalist logic that got us into this mess in the first place to try and address our sustainability challenges, which is what Alan Bradshaw called tragic beauty. So these competing positions illuminate some of the perspectives on right and wrong, good and bad in relation to sustainable consumption. And on the one hand, we see positions that defend consumption as a driving force or site for positive environmental change, whereby the consumer is seen to be willing, able to, and accountable for choosing the right products. For example, cooking from scratch rather than buying a takeaway with food in plastic containers. But authors such as Danny Miller, for example, will say that these are elitist attempts to push certain ideals and to ascertain class-based distinction, given that consuming green can be costly and consequently only a privileged few can access sustainable products. Indeed, people are experiencing the effects of poverty right here, right now, as we witness increasing numbers of people who transition into food insecurity, which is what my colleagues and I discuss in the paper you see on the screen. So when people live in a state of liminality under precarious conditions, they struggle to access healthy foods that are not processed or excessively packaged. They're at a loss, not only from a nutrition and health perspective, but also because they're excluded from normalized food practices. They can feel stigmatized and ashamed. And we cannot expect food packaging to be a priority in such dire circumstances. Now, I know that it might seem that I've diverted from the subject a little bit, but actually this food insecurity example sheds light on three very important points. One is the importance of tackling inequalities alongside the environmental issues we face, and we've started to discuss this morning. We need to be very careful that we do not further exacerbate existing social problems and power relations through structured elitism and exclusion in our attempts to do the right thing for the environment. So we really need to find solutions that reduce over-reliance on plastics without raising costs for the end consumer, because unfortunately poverty is on the rise. I mean, we're talking about 1 in 4 people today are below the poverty line, right? So the second point is that while sustainability concerns in the form articulated in the Brundtland report are relatively new, this moralization of consumption is an ancient element of human politics and a part of how our relationship with the materiality of our world has evolved. Historically, people have always deliberated on how and the amount they consume. So examples of this are Veblen's work criticizing conspicuous consumption as early as 1899, and Thoreau's Calvinist material morality of efficiency, thrift, and self-responsibility that enabled the voluntary simplicity movement of the 19th century. The third point, which I find really relevant, is that the social practice in this example is eating, right? So we might have a practice that is about eating and cooking. It might be about traveling and hospitality and so on. So while plastics might act as conduits for certain social practices, and while we as academics might focus the locus of analysis on plastics, plastics in and of themselves are not at the center of consumers' lives. So we need to get better at bringing it into what Giddens would call discursive consciousness, so that we can get people to be more, act with more agency around plastics. Now, this brings me to another point, which is that early and ongoing attempts to understand and advance sustainable consumption inevitably foreground the need to reshape individual behaviors, which again reinforces the tendency towards responsibilizing individuals. Examples include, of course, expectancy value models and the TPB and so on. However, we know that attitudes and values only partially explain consumers' intentions and behaviors, and researchers who examine sustainable consumption as individual choice wrestle with these attitude, behavior, or value action gaps, where positive values and attitudes towards sustainable behaviors seemingly fail to translate into action. The problem is that such approaches neglect to consider the wider societal forces that permeate consumers' everyday practices. And this is something that we discuss in this particular paper that you see on the screen. Now, and then there is the issue of information and complexity, right? And that's a big one for me, because there's so much ambiguity and overload that causes confusion for people. So unless we know what a behavior means in carbon terms, because really what we're trying to do is reduce the carbon that we're emitting and what this all means in terms of carbon, right? So unless we know what this means in carbon terms, and unless this is communicated clearly, correctly, and credibly, we cannot know whether our choices are indeed sustainable. So in this paper on the screen, we show that consumers can get confused. So this is about nutrition, right? So people can get confused about inconsistent, incomplete, and contradictory nutrition information provided by marketeers and other stakeholder groups. This then leads to information or to the formation of flawed baseline knowledge about nutrition, poor nutrition literacy, and unhealthy eating, even though people believe that what they're doing is eating healthily, right? So information and baseline knowledge are really important issues to consider when in the context of plastics too, I believe. Because if people stop buying single-use plastics and then they go on to buy something that's even worse, we will not achieve what we set out to achieve in sustainability terms. So in this new research by a team at Manchester, which I've posted on the right on the screen, which they publicized via The Conversation, they claim that they claim that reusable plastics are not always better than single use. And the science is sound, right? But you can see how this new information might lead to consumer confusion down the line. So it is not just down to the consumer. We need various stakeholder groups to play a role in tackling sustainability issues, including how we use plastics. A focus on individual consumers and the attitude behavior gap promotes an incomplete picture of consumer behavior and problematic notions of consumer sovereignty and responsabilization. Problematic because they cement the belief that the responsibility and capacity to drive change rests just with the consumer, while what we're dealing with really are environmental issues that are a result of the activities of various marketplace actors, issues that are of systemic and global scale. By focusing on the gap as a construct, we are actually perpetuating dominant growth-driven consumerist logics and ideologies that potentially reinforce perceptions of personal failure and disengagement, or even causing rejection of sustainable behaviors. Instead, as Michal Carrington would suggest, we need research, and I would argue interventions that are directed at identifying, researching, and changing problematic underlying structures and forces that create and benefit from this alleged gap. So this means that individual responsabilization is contentious and demands research that acknowledges consumers and their practices as located within wider social structures. And therefore, by examining practices, for example, which is what we're doing in these papers that you see on the screen, and by practices, we mean groups of actions or activities held together by interconnected sets of meanings, skills, and stuff. In other words, the stuff that we buy, the materials that we use. We then start to unpack what can be done and by whom to change behavior, but in ways that go beyond the sole focus on the individual or individual psychology. By mapping the social, historical, or ethnographic trajectory of a practice, researchers can identify and deconstruct which meanings, which materials, and which competencies support sustainable practices, and can look for ways to improve them by reconfiguring one or more of these elements. For example, we might study the historical development and normalization of cooking or cleaning practices where single-use plastics might feature as a material to understand how plastics became normalized and habitualized, and the elements of the practice that lend themselves to plastic substitutions to nudge behavioral change. And so we also know that behavior change using behavior economics principles tend to be effective for influencing consumer decision-making in the context of habitual, non-deliberative behaviors. So these include simplification and framing. So for example, let's say by choosing this packaging, you have just saved X trees, right? Because that makes it very clear to the consumer. Changes to the physical environment involving product placement decisions or placement or changes in the architecture of the foodscape or retail environment. So one example might be, you might choose to place products with sustainable packaging at the eye level on the retail shelf, so that, you know, that's the kind of go-to choice. And also, for example, making sustainable the default option. So we see this in restaurants where plastic straws and bottled drinking water are not available, or they're made available upon request. And another example might be the use of social norms, right? So for example, if we inform a consumer that other consumers living in their building recycle twice as much as they do, and that they save X tons of CO2 emissions per year compared to what this other consumer does, they're more likely to jump in and do their bits as well. Now, again, we need a kind of a multi-stakeholder approach, multi-stakeholder interventions, engagement, and responsabilization too at various scales. So, for example, Ross Gordon's recent work on community storytelling in the context of energy saving is really interesting, and it is fascinating work, really. And apologies, my screen has disappeared here.
You can still see it on our side, Caroline. Has it just disappeared off yours? It's gone black, maybe?
Yeah, it has. I'm so sorry about this.
Oh, there's no problem. We can. I think the rest of us can still see it.
No, I can't see it as well.
Here you go. Here you go. Okay. So sorry about that. I'm so sorry. Okay. So going back to Ross's work. So Ross Gordon's recent work on community storytelling in the context of energy saving is really interesting and highlights the importance of bridging community members and experts, and of enabling community members to act as spokespersons for sustainability messages within their own communities. And I think in many ways, this is what you're doing here today, right? You're creating those bridges and creating those opportunities for conversations that join up these different stakeholder groups. And this is so important so that we can learn from each other and actually bringing these different diverse perspectives can only help to enhance the approaches that we can use going forward. And so, in addition to this, I think in this particular JBE paper, which is quite old now, but my colleagues and I were looking at this idea of fostering a community approach to sustainable practices, and we looked at this case study of Modbury, which is a town down in Devon, And this is really an example of a pioneering, really successful community initiative that played a key role in changing both consumers and supermarkets' behaviors in relation to single-use plastic bags. So you could argue that they changed everything we see today in relation to plastic bags. They started it, right? And they were very successful because they had all the ingredients that are necessary for behaviors to diffuse. So, for example, they had Rebecca Huskins, who was like this filmmaker from BBC, who was a catalytic individual, super influencer, who managed to get everyone together. And she was willing to do the groundwork. She was willing to engage in kind of environmental education with the SMEs, local retailers. She researched plastic substitutes. She enabled them to enact those changes required. And she also used effectively social norms, because once some of the retailers got on board, then the ones who weren't on board, they felt really guilty for not being on board, and they felt left out. And so they wanted to join in as well. So there was a kind of a pulling of everyone together that went on with that particular case. And they were noted by, you know, many commentators at the time as people who really kind of drove a significant bit of change in terms of single-use plastics. Finally, in this work over here, this is also in a JBE paper. My colleagues and I we're very much looking at sort of, you know, who's creating harms and how can we start to tackle this? And we did take an institutional theory approach there, and we looked at some of the institutional forces in the context of the jewelry industry. So all these works have been in various different contexts, but I think that this particular one applies very much to what we're looking at here today. And so we don't examine plastics as such, but the analytical framework is actually quite useful, because we look at what stakeholders are causing harm, which ones are being harmed, and which ones are in a position to address these harms across you know, the pre-production, production, consumption, and post-consumption stages of the plastic life cycle. So without losing sight of the institutional forces that regulate, the institutional forces that validate, and the institutional forces that habitualize both old and new behaviors. So these forces have the capacity to do both, to perpetuate what exists, but also to nudge the forces, and we need to use them in a way that really helps us move forward with these goals that we need to achieve so pressingly. So, and here are some concluding thoughts. As we attempt to understand and engage and change consumer practices, we need to remember that consumers are embedded in wider social structures, and that we must tackle these issues in ways that not only refrain from exacerbating inequalities and vulnerabilities, but that also help to improve and prevent them. I have attempted to outline relevant theoretical perspectives and frameworks that can be helpful in understanding and reducing our over-reliance on plastics, while acknowledging the range of stakeholder factors and forces that affect these behaviors. I would like to end this presentation by reinforcing that we need multi-stakeholder interventions, engagement, and responsabilization to be able to achieve change at the scale and pace required to tackle our sustainability crisis. And I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to present this work today.
So thank you for the introduction, and thank you, Caroline, as well, for sharing your insights around responsibility and sustainability more broadly, and bringing them into the debates around plastic packaging. So before I start, I'd just like to say I'm very excited to be here for our first knowledge transfer event. And I'm working with James and Alex in the Consumption Insights element of the project. Okay. So for this presentation, we focus on how consumer responsibility is represented across the plastic packaging landscape, and the implications of this for consumers. So when we say plastic packaging landscape here, we are talking about the discourse from stakeholders across all stages of the consumption cycle, to UK government regulations and legislation, to media, public opinion and NGOs. So this presentation draws together some of the findings specifically relevant to the theme of consumer responsibility based on an initial scope of the literature. And we know that food plastic packaging has come under the spotlight, and the global environmental implications associated with the origins, the use and the disposal of plastic are increasingly a matter of concern. And within media publications, we have found that there is a strong tendency to villainize plastic. It becomes this troublesome material that interferes with the natural environment, with marine ecosystems and human biological systems. And consumers are frequently reminded of the volume of plastic packaging waste and the amount sent to landfill. So I wanted to share this quote on the left with you here, taken from an article in the Daily Mail, which provides us with a detailed description and an insight into this catastrophe around plastics and plastic packaging. And it starts off by suggesting that we as the readers and we as a society perhaps are at the centre of the problem. And there are media publications which imply that consumers are at the centre of the solution too, with some providing suggestions as to how we as individual consumers can make a difference through our consumption choices. Studies in the academic literature reveal that there is a sense of consumer responsibility, that consumers are concerned about the implications of plastic packaging, and it indicates that consumers do have this moral imperative to reduce the amount of food plastic packaging that they consume. Yet there are studies, and as Caroline has already mentioned, that have shown how environmental concerns do not simply translate into practice. And so we have this attitude behaviour gap that Maria talked about earlier on. And this brings into question this paradigm then for individual consumer responsibility. So let's shift the focus slightly and consider a simple scenario of going camping. So this quote is set in an American context. It's descriptive, just like the previous quote, but this is about doing camping and what camping involves. And the first part makes a reference to setting off and making a stop at the supermarket along the way to load the car with food for the weekend. And as you can see from this description here, showcasing the types of camping foods bought, the hamburgers, the sauces, the condiments. There's no mention of plastic food packaging. It almost becomes invisible here. And on some level, one could arguably say that plastic food packaging becomes a commodity for more experiential forms of consumption. So it's less about the packaging per se, and it's more about the camping experience, the rituals of camping, buying and consuming types of foods that you may not necessarily consume at home, or because they taste better when you're going camping, and the packaging just becomes a part of that. So one of the implications of this narrative around consumer responsibility and individual consumer choice is that the embeddedness of plastic food packaging in consumers' lives is taken for granted. And until the environmental concerns had come to light, plastic food packaging enjoyed a fairly inconspicuous life despite its omnipresence and its visibility and its tangibility. And as indicated within the academic literature, it has become so normalised now that it's difficult to imagine our lives without it. And as you can see from this statistic here from the Environmental Investigation Agency, plastic food packaging is very much present within our food system. And some of the literature around food packaging more generally kind of talks about how the development of modern packaging, mass production and mass marketing changed our relationship with food, and how packaging enabled consumers to purchase greater quantities of food with a longer shelf life in fewer shopping trips. And Gay Hawkins' work on the culture of disposability talks about how disposable items like the plastic clamshell packaging that you might purchase a pasta salad in facilitate eating on the go, and how packaging is valued for its immediacy, its convenience and its ability to save time. So what becomes an important consideration here when thinking about consumer responsibility is not the packaging in and of itself, but what the packaging enables consumers to do as they go about their everyday lives. And so perhaps it brings into question kind of consumers' expectations around food packaging. So focusing now on the disposal of plastic food packaging, I wanted to turn your attention to one approach to plastic waste and resource consumption, and again consider the implications of this for consumer responsibility. So currently consumers are required to learn or understand the vocabulary of packaging labels, including but not limited to those on the slide here. And some are prescriptive, providing guidelines for disposing of packaging and recycling, and some are informative, indicating the types of materials that the product's made out of, for example. And given the variety of packaging labels and the meanings behind them, it is perhaps not surprising to hear that academic research and consumer research undertaken by NPOs report on consumer confusion around packaging labels. And this idea of consumer confusion is also reinforced through media publications as a barrier to effective recycling in the household. A government EPR consultation document was released in March earlier this year, and this document sets out the provisions for the extended producer responsibility system in the UK. And amongst other proposals, the consultation proposes that mandatory recycling labels should be introduced with the broad requirements set out in legislation to ensure consistency across labelling and to provide clarity to consumers with regards to what can and cannot be recycled. And this is grounded in the belief that if producers play their part, it will enable consumers to play their part, that better information will allow consumers to make better recycling decisions. And whilst this may be the case to a certain extent, it's taken for granted here that recycling labels represent just one piece of information that have a role to play in the fate of consumers' plastic food packaging. So in this context here, consumers have more of a passive role. And of course, this is not to say that consistency across recycling labels is not important, just rather that in isolation, it overlooks the messiness of life, the potential of exposing your own consumption habits to your neighbours as you take your recycling outside to the wheelie bins, or the difficulties of carrying all your recycling down 3 flights of stairs if you live on the 3rd floor in a block of apartments. So the next stage of our research then is our primary data collection. So working closely with 30 households, we are looking to develop this rich insight in understanding of the habits and the routines and the norms of packaging use. And we will also explore their disposal, reuse and recycling practices. And so for this research, we will be carrying out some in-depth semi-structured interviews, asking participants to record diary entries, keep records of the contents of their kitchen cupboards, fridges, freezers and bins, and have more casual, informal conversations, and if permitted, shadow participants as well as they go about their food shopping or prepare a meal at home. So that's everything from me. I apologise for going through that fairly quickly, but I'd be happy to answer any questions, or if we don't have too much time now, please feel free to get in touch.